I never thought I'd be the kind of guy who would write one of these stories. You know the ones, the late-night confessions where someone starts by saying they never thought it would happen to them, and by the end, their entire life is in ruins. I used to read those posts and think, yeah, that sucks, but that could never be me. I was careful. I trusted the right people. I did everything the right way. Turns out none of that matters when the person who destroys you shares your last name. I'm 36 years old now, sitting alone in a small apartment that still smells like cardboard boxes and cheap beer. It's almost midnight, and the only sound in the room is the refrigerator humming and my own thoughts getting louder the longer I sit here. I've replayed everything so many times that it feels like a movie I can't turn off. The job I lost, the marriage that collapsed, the family business that disappeared overnight, but none of that hurts as much as knowing exactly who caused it. My younger brother, and for a long time the scariest part wasn't what he did to me. The scariest part was how close I came to believing I deserved it. I'll call myself Matt. It's not my real name, but it's close enough. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where everyone knows your business before you do. The kind of place where your reputation sticks with you from kindergarten to the grave. My dad owned a modest construction supply business. Lumber, hardware, contracts with local builders, nothing fancy, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table. Dad used to joke that the business was the third child he never had, and growing up, it honestly felt that way. I was the older brother by 4 years, the responsible one, the kid who stayed late after school to help Dad clean the shop, who locked up at night, who learned early that being dependable mattered more than being liked. My brother Jake was different. He was charming, funny, and had this way of making people feel important just by talking to them. Teachers liked him, coaches loved him. Even when he screwed up, people laughed it off like it was part of his personality. I didn't resent him for that. At least I don't think I did. I just accepted our roles. I handled responsibility, he handled people. By my late 20s, I was working full-time at the business. I managed inventory, vendors, accounts, all the unglamorous stuff that actually keeps a company alive. Jake joined later, mostly in sales. Customers loved him instantly. Vendors remembered his name. Employees relaxed when he walked into a room. I told myself it was fine. Someone had to be the steady one. Back then, I was married to Emily. We'd been together since our early 20s, married for 7 years. She was a high school teacher, organized, thoughtful, the kind of person who plans everything 2 months ahead. We didn't have kids yet. We kept saying we were waiting for things to settle down, for work to calm down, for the timing to feel right. Looking back now, I realize things never settled because the foundation was already cracking. Jake started coming to family dinners more often, company barbecues, holiday parties. Emily liked him. Everyone did. She used to say he was just easy to be around. I trusted him completely. He was my brother. That trust would end up costing me everything. The first real shift was subtle. Dad started leaning on Jake for ideas about growth and expansion. Jake talked big: branding, new markets, future opportunities. I focused on keeping the lights on and the bills paid. When Jake made mistakes, he laughed them off. When I fixed those mistakes quietly, nobody noticed. Guess who looked like the visionary? Then my dad had a minor stroke, not enough to kill him but enough to scare him. Enough to make him start thinking about the future of the business. One night after closing, he sat me down in his office, the same office I'd been cleaning since I was 14, and told me that Jake and I would take over together. I nodded, relieved. That was fair, that made sense. Then he said Jake had the vision and that my role was to support him. Support him. I swallowed it like I always did. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself loyalty mattered more than ego. That was the night my brother stopped treating me like family and started seeing me as something in his way. A couple months later, Dad called an emergency meeting. The accountant was there. A lawyer I'd never met was there. Jake looked nervous. Dad looked furious. I had no idea why. The accountant slid a folder across the table, and inside were transaction records with my name on them, withdrawals, missing funds. Thousands of dollars. I actually laughed because it was so absurd. I said it wasn't real. I said there had to be a mistake. Jake didn't look at me. He stared at the table like he couldn't bring himself to speak. Dad's voice shook when he asked me to explain myself. That was the moment my life split into before and after. and I swear on everything I have left I had no idea my brother had already decided to burn me alive. At first, I thought the meeting was some kind of misunderstanding that would clear itself up in a few minutes. I kept waiting for the accountant to say there'd been a clerical error or for Jake to finally look up and say this was all wrong. That moment never came. Instead, the lawyer started asking questions in a calm, neutral voice, the kind that makes everything feel 10 times more serious. Dates, amounts, authorization. Every question felt like another brick being added to a wall that was slowly boxing me in. I explained everything. I told them I never touched that money. I walked them through my usual responsibilities, the systems I used, the fact that I didn't even have authorization to make half of those withdrawals. I remember talking fast, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Dad listened, but his eyes didn't soften. He just looked tired, betrayed. Like a man realizing too late that something precious might already be gone, Jake finally spoke and his voice cracked just enough to sound believable. He said he didn't want to believe it either. Said he'd noticed some things not adding up and hoped it was just a mistake. Said he wished it wasn't true. He never once looked directly at me. That hurt more than anything else in that room. By the end of the meeting, nothing was resolved. But the damage was done. Doubt had entered the room, and once it's there, it doesn't leave quietly. Dad told me to take a few days off while they sorted things out. He said it like it was for my own good, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. The trust that had taken decades to build was suddenly fragile. When I got home that night, Emily could tell something was wrong before I even said a word. I sat at the kitchen table and explained everything. I told her about the meeting, the accusations, the money. She listened quietly, arms crossed, her face tight with concern. When I finished, she didn't immediately defend me the way I expected. She asked questions, calm ones. Careful ones, questions that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt like tiny cuts all the same. Did I ever move money around without telling anyone? Was it possible I forgot? Could someone have misunderstood something I did? I told her no, over and over. I told her I'd never risk our future like that. She nodded, but there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, uncertainty. Over the next few weeks, everything shifted. At work, people stopped joking around me. Conversations went quiet when I walked into a room. I caught employees exchanging looks when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Jake became more visible, more involved, stepping into meetings I used to lead. He acted supportive in public, always saying things like, "We're just figuring stuff out," or "Matt's dealing with some personal things right now." At home, Emily grew distant, not cold exactly, just quieter. She stayed later at school, spent more time grading papers alone in the bedroom. When I asked what was wrong, she said she was just stressed. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. Dad stopped calling me directly. Everything went through Jake or the accountant. I wasn't officially accused of anything yet, but it felt like I was already guilty in everyone's mind. The worst part was the silence. No confrontation, no resolution, just this heavy, constant pressure that followed me everywhere. I started doubting myself in ways I never had before. I went back through old records late at night, staring at numbers until my eyes burned, trying to understand how my name ended up on those transactions. I couldn't make it make sense. Every time I thought I found a clue, it led nowhere. The system logs showed my credentials, my access, my approval. It was like someone had been wearing my skin. Jake started checking in more often. He'd call and ask how I was holding up, tell me Dad was just stressed, say things would work out if I stayed calm. His voice was smooth, reassuring, almost brotherly. If I didn't know better, I would have thought he was genuinely worried about me. One night, Emily told me she was going to grab a drink with coworkers. That wasn't unusual, but something about the way she avoided my eyes made my stomach twist. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband. I didn't want to add jealousy to the list of things tearing us apart. A few days later, Dad told me not to come into work anymore until the investigation was finished. He said it was temporary, procedural, necessary, but hearing it out loud felt like being pushed out of my own life. The business I'd helped build was suddenly off limits to me. That night, Emily and I finally argued, not yelling, worse. That quiet, exhausted kind of fight where every sentence feels like a test you're failing in real time. She admitted she was scared, Scared that the accusations might be true, scared about our finances, scared about what people would think. I told her I needed her to trust me. She said trust wasn't blind. I slept on the couch. That was the first night I realized I might lose more than just my job. A week later, the lawyer called. He said there was enough evidence to move forward, no charges yet, but the word embezzlement was officially on the table. My hands went numb when I hung up. I sat there staring at the wall, trying to remember how my life had spiraled this far out of control so fast. Jake showed up at my apartment that evening. He said Dad was devastated, said he didn't know how this happened, said he wished I'd come to him sooner if I was struggling. I snapped. I told him to stop pretending. I told him I didn't do this. For just a second, something flickered in his eyes, not guilt, not fear, something closer to satisfaction. Then it was gone. The official accusation didn't come with handcuffs or flashing lights. It came quietly, in the form of an email from the lawyer and a certified letter I didn't open for almost an hour because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The word embezzlement was printed in black and white, clinical and emotionless, like it wasn't about my entire life. They weren't pressing criminal charges yet, but the business was moving forward internally. I was being removed permanently, my access was terminated, my position was dissolved. Just like that, the place I'd spent most of my adult life was gone. When I told Emily, she didn't cry, she didn't yell either. She just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, nodding slowly like she was bracing herself for something she'd been expecting. That reaction hurt more than anger would have. It meant part of her had already accepted the version of me everyone else was starting to believe. She asked me what we were going to do. I told her I didn't know. The distance between us kept growing in quiet, invisible ways. She started locking her phone, turning the screen away when she texted, coming home later and later. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. I was too busy trying to survive my own collapse to confront hers. A few days later, my dad called me for the first time in weeks. His voice sounded older, weaker. He said he was disappointed. Not angry, disappointed. That word landed harder than any accusation. I begged him to believe me. I told him I'd give anything to prove my innocence. He said he hoped I was telling the truth, but hope wasn't enough anymore. Then he said Jake would be taking full operational control moving forward. Full control. That night, Emily didn't come home at all. She texted just after midnight saying she needed space and was staying with a friend. I asked which friend. She didn't answer. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch staring at the door, replaying every moment of the last few months, trying to pinpoint exactly where everything had gone wrong. I kept coming back to Jake, to his calm voice, his concerned looks. The way everything seemed to fall into place for him as it fell apart for me. 2 days later, Emily asked to talk. She said it in that careful tone people use when they already know what they're about to do. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where I'd tried to explain everything weeks earlier. She told me she didn't know who I was anymore, that the stress was too much, that she felt like she was living with a stranger. I told her none of this was real, that I was being set up. She said maybe, but she couldn't wait around to find out. Then she said the sentence that finally broke something inside me. She said Jake had been helping her through everything. Listening, supporting her, being there when I didn't accuse her of cheating, not out loud, but the silence between us said everything. She packed a bag that night, just a bag, like she was leaving for a weekend trip. She said she needed time to think. I watched her walk out the door and realized I was completely alone for the first time in my adult life. The next week was a blur of humiliation. Word spread fast in a small town. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided eye contact. Someone anonymously mailed me a newspaper clipping about local business ethics with a line circled in red. I stopped going out unless I had to. Every trip to the grocery store felt like a public trial. Jake, meanwhile, was thriving. I saw it on social media before I heard it anywhere else. Photos of him shaking hands with new partners. Posts about honoring Dad's legacy and moving the business forward. People congratulated him in the comments, praised his strength during difficult times. My name wasn't mentioned once. Then came the final blow. Emily filed for separation. The paperwork cited financial instability and loss of trust. Seeing those words written down made my chest feel hollow. I wanted to scream that none of this was real, that I was being erased by a lie, but there was no one left who wanted to hear it. I went to see Jake one last time. I showed up at the office unannounced. The receptionist hesitated, then let me through. Jake was sitting behind Dad's old desk, my desk. He looked comfortable there, confident, like he'd always belonged. I asked him why. He leaned back in his chair and said he didn't know what I was talking about. Said things just happened. Said maybe I should take responsibility for my mistakes. His smile was subtle, almost polite, but his eyes were cold. That was when I knew, without a doubt, he'd planned this, every step, every lie, every stolen dollar placed perfectly to point back to me. I walked out of that office knowing I'd lost everything. But somewhere between the parking lot and my car, something else surfaced. Not anger, not grief, clarity. If Jake had been patient enough to destroy my life slowly, quietly, legally, then I could be patient enough to take the truth just as far. I had nothing left to lose, and that's when the real story began. The months that followed were the quietest of my life. Not peaceful quiet, the kind that rings in your ears when everything familiar has been stripped away. I moved out of the apartment Emily and I shared and into a one-bedroom place on the edge of town that smelled like old carpet and disinfectant. I sold my truck to cover legal fees and bought a beat-up sedan from a guy on Craigslist who didn't ask questions. Every downgrade felt like a reminder of how far I'd fallen. I picked up work wherever I could, warehouse shifts, inventory counting, night work that didn't require explanations or background checks. People didn't know my story there and I liked it that way. I kept my head down, did my job, went home and sat in silence. Some nights I drank too much, other nights I didn't sleep at all. I kept replaying Jake's face behind that desk, the way he'd looked so comfortable taking my place. At first I told myself I just needed to survive. Revenge wasn't even a real thought yet. I was too tired, too broken, but something kept bothering me, the transactions, the logs, the way everything pointed to me so perfectly. Jake wasn't reckless, he never had been. Which meant if he'd done this, he'd left fingerprints somewhere, he had to have, so I started slow. I pulled old backups from my personal laptop. Emails, archived invoices, anything I still had access to. Most of it looked normal. Boring, but patterns started to emerge if you stared long enough. Access times that didn't line up with my schedule. Approvals logged while I was physically somewhere else. I cross-checked timestamps with text messages, calendar entries, even old photos on my phone. It wasn't proof yet, but it was enough to tell me one thing for sure. Someone had been using my credentials. That someone knew the system as well as I did. I started learning things I never cared about before. Digital audit trails. Metadata, user behavior patterns. I read forums late at night, teaching myself how internal fraud actually works, how people get caught years later because they underestimate how much data never really disappears. Every new piece of information gave me a little more oxygen. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not my lawyer, not my parents, definitely not Emily. I needed this to stay quiet. Jake had thrived because he moved in silence while everyone else trusted him. I wasn't going to make the same mistake. Through mutual contacts, I heard updates about the business. Jake had expanded operations, new contracts, new hires. He was positioning himself as the savior who'd cleaned house and restored integrity. Dad's health had declined and Jake was handling everything. People praised him for stepping up. I wondered if Dad ever questioned how quickly Jake had filled the space I left behind. Then came my first real break. I found an old IT support ticket from years earlier buried in my email archives. It mentioned temporary credential sharing during a system update. At the time, it seemed harmless, routine, but rereading it now made my stomach drop. Jake had been granted limited access under my account during a weekend I was out of town. The ticket was closed quickly, no follow-up. I compared that date to the earliest suspicious transaction. They matched. I didn't celebrate, I didn't smile, I just sat there staring at my screen, heart pounding, realizing I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined this. Jake hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he'd planned this with precision. Over the next year, I built my case piece by piece. I requested public records. I consulted quietly with a forensic accountant under the guise of general advice. I documented everything. I kept timelines, screenshots, notes. I treated it like a second job because in a way it was the only thing keeping me alive. Emily and I finalized the divorce during that time. It was clean, Too clean, no yelling, no apologies, just signatures and silence. She didn't look at me when we signed the papers. I didn't look at her either. I heard later that she'd been spending a lot of time around Jake's office. I never confirmed it. I didn't need to. Some answers only reopen wounds. By the end of the second year, I had enough to know the truth would eventually come out. But knowing something and proving it publicly are two very different things. Jake had money, lawyers, reputation. I had patience, so I waited. I waited until the business grew large enough that outside investors got involved. Until audits became mandatory, until Jake's confidence made him sloppy. Power does that to people, it makes them believe they're untouchable. I kept living quietly, letting everyone think I was finished. By the time I made my move, Jake had no idea I was even still standing, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I didn't expose Jake all at once. That would have been too easy, too loud, and it would have given him time to fight back. What I did instead was let the system he trusted turn against him slowly, quietly, the same way it had turned against me. It started with a tip, anonymous, clean, carefully worded. I sent a packet to one of the new minority investors Jake had brought in, the kind who cared deeply about compliance and liability. Inside was just enough to raise concern, not enough to point fingers. Inconsistencies, timeline questions, a suggestion that an independent forensic audit might be a good idea just to protect everyone involved. I didn't include my name. Within a month, the audit was approved. Jake posted about it online, framed it as transparency, said the company had nothing to hide. Watching that post felt surreal. He sounded exactly like I had during those early meetings, confident that the truth was on my side. The auditors didn't rush. They never do. They combed through years of data, following trails that only look meaningless if you do know where they lead. Trails I'd already mapped out in my apartment at 2 in the morning, fueled by cold coffee and quiet rage. Jake started calling me again around that time. Casual calls, friendly ones, asking how I'd been. Telling me he hoped I was doing okay. I could hear the unease creeping into his voice even though he tried to hide it. I kept my answers short, neutral. I didn't accuse him, I didn't threaten him, I let him wonder what I knew. The first official notice hit 3 weeks later. Internal discrepancies, further review required. Jake told people it was normal, routine, but his posture changed. He stopped posting. He stopped smiling in photos. People noticed. They always do. Then the auditors requested server access logs from the period before I was removed. That's when Jake panicked. He called me late one night, voice tight, asking if I'd ever noticed anything strange back then. Asking if I remembered who had access to what. I told him the truth, carefully edited. I said I remembered everything. Then I asked him why he was so nervous. He hung up without answering. The audit findings were delivered to the board on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I heard about it from someone who was. Unauthorized credential use, patterned withdrawals, deliberate misattribution. My name appeared in the report, so did Jake S. By Wednesday afternoon, Jake was suspended pending further investigation. By Friday, law enforcement was involved, not because I called them but because once investors smell fraud, they protect themselves first. That's how the world works. Dad called me that night. He cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet, broken sobs from a man who finally understood how wrong he'd been. He kept saying he was sorry, over and over. I didn't interrupt him, I let him finish. Emily emailed me a week later. She said she didn't know, said Jake had lied to her too, said she was sorry for not believing me. I read it once and archived it. Some apologies come too late to matter. Jake was arrested 6 months later. White-collar charges. Fraud, identity misuse, breach of fiduciary duty, no sirens, no spectacle. Just consequences catching up to a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. I testified, calmly, briefly, honestly. I didn't look at him when he tried to catch my eye. The business survived, barely. Dad stepped down. The board offered me a role during the restructuring. I declined. I didn't want that life back. I'd already mourned it. I moved cities, started over. Quiet job, quiet apartment. Quiet morning. The fallout didn't end when Jake went away. It never does. Lives don't snap back into place just because the truth finally shows up. For a long time I carried this quiet guilt, like maybe if I'd been louder, sharper, less trusting, none of it would have happened. Therapy helped me understand something important. Betrayal doesn't require permission, it only requires opportunity. My dad and I talk now, but it's different, slower, careful. There's love there, but it's shaped by regret on both sides. We don't talk about Jake much. When we do, it's short and factual, like discussing bad weather from years ago, something that happened, something that passed, something that still left damage behind. I rebuilt my life in ways I never expected, not bigger, not louder, just steadier. I learned how to be alone without feeling empty. I learned how to trust myself again, even if trusting others still takes time. Some nights I still wake up thinking about that meeting room, that folder sliding across the table, that moment when everything I believed about my family shattered. But the memories don't control me anymore. People ask me if I ever miss my old life. The honest answer is no. I miss the version of myself who believed loyalty was always returned. I miss the simplicity of thinking blood meant safety. But I don't miss the blindness. I don't miss being invisible while carrying everyone else's weight. Jake wrote me once from prison, just a short letter, no apology, just explanations. I never responded. Some stories don't need a reply, they need an ending. This is mine. If you're reading this and you're in the middle of being blamed for something you didn't do, hear me when I say this. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone buries it. It waits, and when it comes back, it doesn't ask permission. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's survival. If this story moved you, subscribe to Requiem of Stories, like, share, and tell us your story in the comments.